Welcome to the Behind the Bits podcast. Your host, Scott Curtis, wants to learn everything he can about stand-up comedy and take you along for the ride. Scott and his guests talk serious about comedy in every episode. Behind the Bits will uncover knowledge from different perspectives on subjects such as writing and performing stand-up comedy, as well as booking shows and the comedy life. If you're thinking about becoming a stand-up comic, already in the comic game, or a comedy nerd, Behind the Bits is the show for you. Now, let's get Behind the Bits.
Hey, BTB buddies, I wanted to let you know that I have a Patreon page now so that you can support the show. Check out patreon.com/BTBPC and check out the cool stuff you can get for as little as $2 per month. You can also find the link in the show notes. Thanks, as always, for listening. Speaking of Patreon, I want to thank Steve Frito for being my first Patreon subscriber. Thank you, Steve. Steve is a personal friend who you can see frequently on the BTB Internet Talk Show. Steve is very supporting of the arts and started GoProv, an improv troupe in Goshen, Indiana, several years ago. Steve is also a big part of Art House in Goshen. Art House provides audiences screenings of independent films as well as great live entertainment. Thank you so much, Steve, for your financial and moral support. Be on the lookout for more cool stuff for my Patreon subscribers. Can you say merch? Dan Bublitz, how's it going?
It is going very well today.
I really appreciate you doing this little experiment with me. We were talking before we went live about the issues I've had with sound, and I'm very picky about my podcast having good sound because I've stopped listening to podcasts in my life just because I couldn't handle the sound. So I really want them to sound good, and I've had a few bad experiences. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a speed round where I ask you a few of the questions that everybody wants to know and give you a chance to plug some stuff. And then we're going to go to another method of recording and do the rest of the podcast. So folks, hang on. This is going to be my first try at this, and we'll have some fun.
Ooh, I'm the guinea pig.
It's good to have another podcaster as a guinea pig.
It really is, because we know the trials and tribulations of all this.
No doubt. So first question, Dan, where are you from?
Well, I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota now,
Okay.
But originally I'm from South Dakota. That's where I grew up. And I lived in California for a while too. So
Okay, cool. How long have you been in St. Paul?
a little over a year, actually. We just moved here last April.
Okay, cool. When did you start doing stand-up comedy? At what age were you?
I was 31, just about to turn 32.
Okay.
So it'll be 10 years for me in September.
Okay. What so you've been doing it for 10 years. What prompted you to start doing stand-up comedy?
Divorce.
Okay.
I mean, that's the short answer. But yeah, so it was. I just had went through a divorce, and I'd been married for 12 years, so it was, a substantial amount of time to be married. And I just felt like at the time, it felt like it was all those years were wasted. As I've gotten older, I realized that they weren't, because that marriage and that person helped shape me into who I am today. It was a big part of my life. But in that moment, after the divorce, immediately after, I felt like I wasted 12 years and I didn't want to waste any more of my life. So stand-up was something I always wanted to do, but I never pursued because I got married young and then, got a job, and we were doing the whole, house, cars, all that jazz. And so I never really pursued it. And like I said, I was at this point where I didn't want to be one of these guys that, when I was in my 60s, I'd look back on life and wonder, what if I would have done a thing? And instead, I changed my thought process to, I want to look back and be like, well, that's how that went. Whether good or bad, at least I know. And I gave it a shot. So that's what inspired me to do it.
Right. That's great, and I totally feel what you're talking about, because I was, 19 years behind you. I was 50 when I started, but I'm glad I did. So that's we've got that in common. So as far as comedy influences, who would you say were your influences regarding stand-up comedy?
Well, I mean, it obviously kind of changed. I mean, when I first started, I was always a fan of, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, George Carlin, all the classics. But as I kind of started getting more into stand up and discovering other stand ups, Mike Birbiglia is somebody that I feel really influenced by, because he's a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
He does a lot of storytelling kind of comedy. I'm more storytelling than I am, one-liners and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So his comedy's been kind of big. I'm also John Mulaney is another one, because he's a really good storyteller, things like that. So,
have you listened to Mike's podcast?
I have not. No, not yet.
I believe it's called Working It Out. I highly recommend it. Mulaney's one of his first guests, and it was really good.
I believe he started it on Instagram. Actually, he was doing it as an Instagram live. Yeah.
Yep. And it's really cool. I mean, he's got it structured in a certain way, because that's the way he has to do things. But
yeah.
It's just the type of guy he is. But he does a really good job with it. I really enjoy it. So tell me about the first time you did stand up. What was that like?
Really scary. I mean, that's another thing with me getting into stand-up comedy. It was also overcoming a fear. Because like in high school and growing up, I had a fear of public speaking. So, in high school, giving speeches, that kind of thing, I would get real nervous, and I, get stuttery, and I wasn't good at presenting in front of groups of people. I just had this fear. So part of doing stand-up was getting over that. So for me, the first time I did it, it was very scary. Like I remember crystal clear when they called my name. I walked up on stage and I stood behind the microphone and I looked out into the crowd and I saw all these people sitting out there. And I thought, oh crap, what did I get myself into? And then I picked up the mic and I did a joke and got a few laughs. And then I was like, okay, this isn't as bad as I thought.
That's
and
great.
Then from there, it just it's gotten a lot easier. Now I have no problem with public speaking at all.
Right. Yeah, that tends to happen after you've done it a few times.
Yeah. But I also, it's not like I just went up on a whim. Like I wanted to be very prepared. Like I wasn't probably the best comic that night at that open mic, but I also didn't do terrible, because when I started where I started, there was only one open mic, and it was a monthly open mic, and it was a couple hours from where I lived. So I actually signed up in like June or July for the September open mic. Like I could have got up in the summer, but I was like, I'm not ready. And then once I knew I was going to be doing this open mic in September, I just started writing. So like every day I was writing my material. Then once I got what I thought I was going to do for the 5 minutes, I was rehearsing it all the time. And in front of my at that time, my girlfriend there, she was she would listen to me go through my set. And I was very rehearsed because I wanted to be very prepared. Because another thing that I didn't realize with comedy, you go to an open mic now and people are looking at notepads, looking at phones, things like that. Well, the only thing I knew about comedy is what I saw on TV. And you never saw that people using notebooks and things like that on Comedy Central. And so to me, that wasn't allowed. So I memorized all my jokes. So when I went up that first time, I did not have a sheet of paper, but it was like a script. It was on, and trying to do it basically word for word. So it's very tight.
Yeah. Being prepared, it's a double-edged sword. You put so much work into it that it makes that first time super scary, because you've put so much of yourself into it. Or you go up and just say, I'm just gonna riff. I've got these ideas. I'm gonna try to flush them out on stage. And I've done that. I've done both, and they're both scary, but the anticipation going into that first set is just it's numbing. It's scary as hell.
Yeah. Well, and it really was for me too, because I had a lot of friends and family that came, like, which I was surprised. Even my dad was at the very first open mic. And for that, to me, that was shocking that he would even consider it, because it was in the middle of the week and he works, and just, I was shocked that he did. And so like I had friends and family that drove all the way there. So it was like, man, if I really botch this, like, that's bad.
Yeah.
Because there's quite a few people that went out of their way to see this.
Right.
And at some level, some of them probably were coming to hope to see that hopefully I would fail.
Some people do. Yeah.
Yeah. My first performance is on my YouTube page. Like,
is it?
I still,
cool.
yes,
Yeah.
I keep it there, that first open mic, because it's a good reminder. I go back almost every year and kind of watch it, because then I can see where I started to where I've come as far as stand-up goes, and how I progressed as a performer and a writer and everything else. So it's good to look back and compare, through time.
It's funny because comics seem to be split like 50-50 on keeping their old stuff available on YouTube or whatever they're using, Vimeo or whatever. Some of them are like, you want that as a marker so you know where you came from, and some people are like, I don't want anybody to see this.
Yeah, well, that's the only. I mean, I've definitely had other videos that I've had up there, and then I'm like, oh, this is terrible. And then I've deleted. I've been that guy too, but that was my very, very first time. And like I said, it wasn't horrible. I did okay that night. So, if it would have been a total bomb where I didn't get any laughs and just totally booed off stage or something like that, no, I would not. I probably wouldn't have even put it up on YouTube, let alone keep it there for 10 years.
No doubt. Last question for the speed round. What comedy album or special would you consider your all-time favorite?
Oh my gosh, that is tough. My all-time favorite? Oof. Man, there's no way I can answer that, just because I have such an appreciation for comedy, and there's been so many good specials over the time. I actually just got Richard Pryor's Live on Sunset Strip on vinyl, and I got one of John Mulaney's specials on vinyl just a couple weeks ago. So yeah, I mean, there's so many great specials. It's hard to say what's the greatest.
Okay.
To me, I mean, and it changes over time. That's the other thing. As comedy specials come out, and there's so many of them that have come out. I mean, I'm just trying to think of what I've seen recently that I thought was really good. Like, I really enjoyed both of Patton Oswalt's last two specials were really good. But so yeah, I can't put a top. They're all also good.
Yeah. Okay. I won't hold you to it.
That's good.
Before we get off of live here, I have listened to your podcast, several episodes, and you've been doing it for a while. Can you tell me a little bit about your podcast so other folks can find it?
Yeah, absolutely. So my podcast is primarily a comedy podcast. Sometimes I do have other guests on it, but it's called The Art of Bombing, and the emphasis is in the bombing. It's basically, our tagline is finding success through failure, because what we're doing is we're looking at a different perspective of performing arts, and we're looking at failure, because a lot of podcasts, especially comedy podcasts, it's kind of the same. They kind of the same thing, the interviews, or they look at, what was your best show, blah, 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 blah. And they're looking at that kind of stuff. And I wanted to look at it from a different perspective, because for me, it was inspired by a show where I bombed really bad. And I just was like, I feel like, I want to talk about this, and I want to see if other people, and as I've done the podcast, I've realized that bombing is part of comedy. Like it is part of what we do. So So it's basically that. It's what we do is I usually, I have a guest, like I said, primarily it's a comedian, and we talk about comedy. We talk about, they share a story of a time when they bombed, and then we talk about, what they learned from it, how they've improved, what they do to try to get better, things like that. And then we end up talking about all kinds of subjects. It's not always comedy, we get on little tangents. I've talked about movies and video games and comic books and all kinds of different things, depending on the different guests and things like that. But it's primarily focused about getting better at comedy.
Okay, great. And I really have enjoyed listening to it. And I also enjoy the little mini episodes you do that are instructional. You put one together about how to do a press kit. You've done how to put on a live show and stuff like that. And I want the people listening and watching to know that a lot of comics have gotten on the podcast bandwagon since the pandemic hit, but you've been around.
Oh yeah, I have. I mean, we just celebrated in May. I celebrated 3 years with the Art of Bombing podcast.
Yeah. So you're more of a veteran, and you're not a Johnny come lately or just a newbie. So you do a very good job with it.
Well, you can, if you listen to the first episodes and compared to the most recent episodes, you can tell that I put some effort into the podcast because it has come a long ways. Because the first couple episodes are terrible as far as the content. The content and the people that I talked with were great, but the quality was terrible because the first one I recorded was with a comic out in Washington, and it was with my phone on a table outside of a bar, and you can hear motorcycles driving by and cars, people talking and things like that. So the quality was terrible.
I can totally relate to that. I did a local podcast for years before I started this one, and I made so many mistakes. It was just, I was like, I can record you outside of this outside of the bar. I've got this great recorder, and there won't be any noise at all. And guess what? There's a lot of noise.
Yeah, and that's just it. Like over time, because like I said, the podcast, I try to make a better product, and I've taken feedback and criticism from people. They're like, hey, you should maybe try this, and I'm always trying to improve it. And that's one thing I put a lot into the podcast over the last few years, from upgrading, a lot of it's been upgrading equipment and things like that. So and now it sounds pretty good.
Okay, we're back at it. First off, Dan, thanks for helping me with the speed round, doing that for the first time. I think that was fun.
Yeah, that was a good time.
Yeah. And I want to dig a little bit further into the fact that you always wanted to do stand-up. And so we talked about the fact that you got married young and did the whole go to work stuff. And so that, that delayed the whole starting stand-up thing. But let's talk about you as a kid and the first time that you thought stand-up was cool.
Well, honestly, as a kid, I wasn't necessarily into stand-up comedy as much as I was sketch comedy. I've always been a big fan of Saturday Night Live and Kids in the Hall and a lot of those sketch type shows. So those were, and even in Living Color and things like that, I loved sketch comedy. But then as I got old, kind of older and in my early 20s, I just had, kind of a more of appreciation for stand-up comedy.
And when you were getting that appreciation for stand-up comedy, was this when you were in South Dakota?
Yeah. Yep. I lived in South Dakota a majority of my life. Okay. In fact, I did not move away from South Dakota until I was 32 years old. So for the first 32 years of my life, aside from like one spell where I moved for like 2 months, I moved to Minnesota briefly. So I don't even count it. It was that short. I lived in South Dakota.
I asked this because, I've been in Indiana all my life, and it seems like one of the only states that gets current with stuff later than Indiana would be South Dakota, because it's just so out there,
Oh yeah, there's always those jokes about where you live, but it's like everything seems like South Dakota is like 10 years in the past with everything.
Yeah. So were you
behind on everything?
Yeah, were you small town South Dakota or big city?
Well, okay. Let's not get carried away with big cities. There's not really big cities in South Dakota anyway. I mean, the largest city doesn't even have 200,000 people, and when you compare that to like a Minneapolis or, cities like that, it's pretty small in comparison. But the city that I did grow up in was it wasn't like a small town, but it was one of the larger towns in South Dakota when I was growing up. It's not now, but I lived in a town of about 20,000 people.
Okay. Yeah, you probably had a stoplight and a McDonald's then, right?
Oh yeah, we had.
See, my town didn't even have that, so they've got a stoplight now because enough people got killed at that intersection, but still no McDonald's.
That's usually what it takes.
Yeah.
So I shouldn't laugh at that.
Yeah, I know, but it's what it is.
But it's true.
Yeah. Yeah, my brother almost died at that intersection. He got T-boned, and his car was just totaled. I don't know how he even survived it, but he came out without much, even a scratch. So but it's got a stoplight now, so everybody's safe.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, they also put a bypass around it so nobody goes through it now.
Oh, I gotcha. They put a bypass. Okay.
Yeah. It's so like
they don't have to go through that intersection anymore.
Yeah,
I was thinking of a roundabout.
Yeah, well, this is an actual bypass, and it goes right through. I can see the home I grew up in on it, and it's funny because I drove to Indianapolis for work, and when I lived in Indy and I was dating my wife, she was up here. I made that drive so many times, and now there's a bypass around my little town, the little town after it, and all the way around Kokomo. And that drive is like 45 minutes less because of those bypasses now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. If I would have only had them when I was younger, but I'll take them now because we still fly out of Indy quite a bit. So it's a much shorter drive. So
That's good.
So thinking about when you did start, now you talked about in the speed round that you came out of divorce and decided you wanted to start doing the stuff that you dreamed about. Did you think about what kind of a comic you wanted to be?
Oh no, I had no clue. I didn't even know what there was different kind. I mean, I was so naive when I started because, like I said, the only thing I knew about stand-up comedy was really what I saw on TV. I mean, you got to figure, I always lived in smaller towns, so there wasn't like necessarily live access to live comedy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I was in my 20s, there was one time when I almost started doing stand-up, and it was again, my wife and I had a big falling out, and we kind of separated for a couple of days, and we were very young in our marriage, and so there was a potential that we were going to split up. And during that time, that short split, I went to a live comedy show with a buddy because I was like, hey, I kind of want to do stand-up. Let's go to this live show. And we went and watched a live comedian, and we were kind of writing some ideas down, not from that show, but we just wanted to kind of see what live stand-up comedy was.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of started, bouncing some ideas down for, maybe doing some writing and stuff to maybe kind of pursue it. But then we got back together, and I pretty much threw it back on the back burner again.
Did your friend pursue it?
No, nope.
Okay.
Nope. And it's funny too, though, because at the time he had just got out of college, and he had a degree in creative writing. So if we would have if we would have did something together, it probably would have been pretty good. But he ended up now he's a nurse in Alaska. So
well, well, good for him. Somebody's got to do it.
Yep.
So thinking about you don't know exactly what you want to be, and you do that first time. What notes did you take from that first time of doing stand-up? And also, what prompted you to do the second time?
Well, honestly, as soon as I got a decent laugh the first time, I was immediately hooked. Like I'm sure it's, people have talked about this in comedy, that the adrenaline rush from making people laugh and being on stage is probably very similar to, being addicted to drugs or, having that rush from that kind of thing. And I immediately felt it, as soon as I got a laugh, I was like, all right, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And, and I mean, I knew that from the very first time I did the open mic. Like I said, when I walked out on stage and I looked out into the audience and saw all those people, and I thought, oh my God, what did I get myself into? I took that breath. I told my first joke and I got a laugh, and I was immediately like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. And then I, plowed my way through that. And then after that, it wasn't a matter about getting myself to go back up, because I already knew this is what I wanted to do. So now it was more of a matter of what do I got to do to go back up? Because at the time, like I said, that particular open mic was only once a month. And there's not like, there wasn't even a comedy scene. There was a handful of comics that were doing these monthly open mics, and sometimes they would get to open at the local comedy club at the time on the weekends. But a lot of those people also worked at the club as a dishwasher or whatever. So, or a busboy and things like that. So there's a lot more to than just getting to host or whatever. So for me, it was a matter of just trying to find when I could do it. And I was working a full-time job at the time.
Yeah, no doubt. So basically, that open mic's a couple hours away. It's once a month. How long did you do that before you said, I want more, and started looking for other places to do it?
I almost immediately decided that, I knew that I couldn't be, because I like I said, I had the full-time job, so it was harder for me to go drive there and then drive back, get up to go to work the next day, that kind of thing. So I immediately kind of started looking at my options, and, I started producing within my first 6 months of, doing a show. At the time when I started comedy, I lived in Watertown, South Dakota, which is a small town. It's about an hour and a half north of Sioux Falls, and Sioux Falls that's the biggest city in South Dakota. That's where the comedy club was. That's where I did my first open mic, etc. And I just knew I couldn't go back and forth all the time. And so I started looking at setting up my own open mic and my own show where I lived. And so I did that right away. And I did like a monthly open mic, and I ended up, I did it as an experiment. It did really good. And then I started bringing in like regional headliners and features. So what we would do, we would charge a cover. We'd have an open mic, because most of the people too that would come to this open mic were just to perform, were just my friends that thought this was cool and wanted to try stand up too. None of them are still doing it. They were just, oh, this is cool, let's try it. And they all kind of gave it a try. And then after I moved, it kind of went away. But we would have an open mic, so people, if they wanted to go up, they could. And then we'd have feature or headliner close out the show.
Did you when you were doing just the open mic that you produced, were there any diamonds in the rough? Did somebody really stand out to you?
Oh, there was quite a few people that stood out. I mean, one that, and he was already kind of doing comedy anyway. He had a background in improv, and he still does comedy. He's one of my really good friends, which is Nathan Holtz, who we kind of started close to the same time. But he was always really funny. And there was a couple other people that aren't doing comedy now that did kind of stand out, that would have been funny.
Mhm.
Probably could have did well with it. I mean, their material was a little risky, but we actually, that same friend that I'm talking about, he came with me to that first open mic. And that open mic too, the other thing I forgot to mention is the first open mic that I did was also like a contest. So they would pick like the top two, whoever, got voted the best or whatever. And then they would come back for the season championship or whatever, which, so they would do like 7 or 8 months of this monthly open mic / contest. And then all the winners would come back for an annual contest. And then the winner would get to do some MC work or something like that.
Okay.
But my friend that came with me, he ended up winning our night.
Oh, wow.
He made it into the finals.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So it's funny. I feel like a lot of people who think that they could be a good comic are the ones who would never be a good comic. But there's a lot of people out there that don't even know that they've got that in them. And if they just went up once, they could be a great comic.
Yeah, I would say that to some extent. That's probably true. I mean, there have been instances where somebody went up on a bet and did really good. But, the other thing is there's a lot of structure in comedy, and people can go up and maybe be funny for 5 minutes one time, and then the next time they go try to copy that or mimic it, and then they're not that funny. And then they realize, oh, wait, I'm not good at this because I just had that one fluke.
Yeah.
I actually have to put some structure into this and try to actually write a setup and write a punchline, things like that.
Right. That's why you get so many 2-timers.
Yep.
First one's good, second one's bad. I'm out of here. It's funny. We in South Bend, where our club is, the Drop Comedy Club, we had a guy that I saw go up twice, and he was just awful. And he moved to Michigan, and he came back and did a set, and it was like a totally different person. He was hilarious. And I asked him, I said, what happened? And he said, well, first of all, I knew I was terrible. So I stopped and didn't go to open mics for a while and started writing, and then practiced and came back to it and totally changed. I mean, his act was completely different.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's cool when they have enough, I guess, self-awareness to know that, I suck, but I can be better, and I still want to do this, and they keep at it. I always admire that.
Well, and I think that's something for comedy. If you want to get good at comedy, you do at some level have to be pretty self-aware. You have to, and that's, like I said, that's kind of what inspired my podcast is being self-aware.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was looking at what I was doing wrong and things like that, and how to get better. I think I was the same way. I actually 6 months after I started comedy, I moved out to California. I moved to San Diego. And my thought, of course, after doing a few mics and a couple guest spots on some shows around South Dakota, that I was ready for the big time. I'm going to go to LA and I'm going to be famous, And I ended up in San Diego just because the girl that I was dating, her family lived there. So we ended up moving there, which is close enough to LA. But I moved out there and I started going to a couple of their open mics, and I was like, I am terrible. Like I was seeing some of these guys that and performers that were just amazing. And this is at open mics, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not this. I need to, get better. And that, a lot of that is writing better and performing better and things like that. So it also helps having the a good amount of stage time, because that was another thing. I went from maybe being able to perform 2, maybe 3 times a month if I was lucky, but typically it was 1 to 2 times a month, to being able to perform 2 to 3 times a day, almost 7 days a week.
Yeah.
If I wanted. I mean, because I had a girlfriend and things like that, I wasn't able to make that happen. I had other obligations or whatever, but if I wanted to, I could have went real hard at it. But even having, the option to go up 3 or 4 times a week as opposed to 1 to 2 times a month, you improve so much.
When you discovered that, you weren't the greatest thing since applesauce in San Diego, how did you regroup? What did you do to tighten up the writing, tighten up your sets, and make yourself better? What process did you go through to get there?
I listen. That would be one of the biggest things is I listened. And when I say that, I listened to other comics that were more experienced than me, and took advice on things, for me, granted we're in comedy and ego's a big thing or whatever. I try not to let my ego get in the way of anything. Like I try to stay as grounded as I possibly can in all aspects. At some level there is ego because of, performing in front of people for the instant gratification, yada, yada, yada. But when a more experienced comic would give me advice or offer advice, I wasn't going to I wasn't going to be a jerk and be like, well, I don't need your advice. I'm doing comedy on my own. I don't need no help. I'm the expert, because I wasn't. I'm not an expert. I'm new. And when to get better at something, you got to do it for one, practice makes perfect, but you also need to learn from people who have been doing it for a long time and who are good at it. There's a thing about, if you're in a comedy scene and you're hanging out with the comics that are the best in that scene, that's going to push you to want to be better too, because you've got that competition, but it's not like a necessarily like a bad competitiveness where you're like out to get each other. It's a good competitive where it's like, oh, you're pushing each other to do better. It's like, oh, my friend's really good, I need to get on his level, so you work harder. But going back to the listening thing, when I moved to San Diego, I started working with there was a production company out there that worked in a lot of venues. A lot of the shows that they did were in venues that were kind of all ages. And so they were very, they really pushed having clean and clever material. That was always kind of the thing, not a lot of profanity, not being gross, not a lot of shock comedy, but being clever, didn't mean that you couldn't talk about adult things. It was how you worded it, So working with them, that helped improve, my writing, because now, like I said, when I started comedy, I had no idea the different kinds of comedy. I didn't know what shock comedy was. I didn't know there was a difference with political comedy or one-liners or storytelling. Like none of this, I didn't know any of this until you start getting involved in comedy and going to live shows and going to open mics and, seeing other comics work, and then you start realizing, oh, there's all these different things. So that was one of the biggest things for me. I did a lot of observing, when I went to a couple mics out there before I even did my first open mic and just kind of watched just to see what I was getting into and checked out some of the clubs and stuff. But anytime somebody wanted to offer me advice, that if I felt like if they were somebody that had been doing comedy for a while and somebody that, definitely could respect, I would listen to what they had to say. And even somebody that's new and doesn't, if somebody, says, hey, would you mind if I give you a tag? Sure. I'll check it out. I'm not necessarily going to use it. It might not, somebody could give me a tag and it might be an okay tag, but it just doesn't fit my delivery style, that kind of thing. But I'm always willing to listen, but let's be clear, that's to other comics, like if some random stranger in the audience comes up and says, hey, I got a joke you can use, I instantly tune out, like I don't need your street joke. Right. That kind of thing. But yeah, so a lot of it was listening, taking advice and listening. And I just working with that group alone, that improved me a lot, because I had a lot of tics that I didn't realize. And, you had to audition to perform with them too, which was kind of a weird thing, but they would, if you they didn't do like the video thing. They insisted doing a live audition. And a lot of times what it was is they would have a show. After the show, some of the other comics that they worked with regularly and the producers of that show would audition comics on, after the fact. You'd come up and do like a 3 to 5 minute audition in front of these veteran comics. Mm-hmm. And then they would kind of decide if they wanted to maybe use you for a little guest spot or something like that.
Man, that's got to be scary.
Yeah, but they also offered very good criticisms.
Yeah.
Like I had a lot of ticks. One thing, Chris Klauber is a comic that's been in San Diego for a long time. He's been doing comedy for like 30 years, really good writer, very funny. And he was one of the producers of this show at the time. And he was good at, pointing out things. And I had a lot of ticks that I didn't even realize I had. And like for one of the things is when I was thinking of my next joke, I would look down a lot instead of looking into the audience and being engaged with them. I was looking down or looking up or looking away. And he was like, I see you doing this. And I know it's because you're trying to think of your next joke. But even though you're thinking of your next joke, you should still at least be looking into the audience. You don't necessarily have to make eye contact, but look out there because at least it looks like you're engaging with the audience. Mm-hmm. And then I started watching videos after he pointed that out, and I was like, holy shit. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can swear, but
yeah, you can.
I was like, holy crap. Wow, I do that a lot. That's terrible. And so I, once I noticed I had that tick, I started trying to correct it.
That's, the self-awareness you have is great. And the thing you talked about listening, it comes through so much in your podcast. The podcast is The Art of Bombing. I'm going to mention it a few times. Mm-hmm. I've listened to so many podcasts where the host has such a big ego that you can tell that they talk. I mean, they talk way more than their guest does. And they either do that or they are asking questions just to get to the next question. So they're not even listening to the guest.
Oh, and yeah. They're just trying to get through the motions.
Right. And in your podcast, The Art of Bombing, it is very engaging. I can tell that you really want to know what these folks have to say. And that you want to learn from them. And I appreciate that type of a podcast because it draws me in. I don't need star power for when I'm listening to podcasts. I want somebody who really is into it and wants to learn, and you really get a good episode. And I haven't heard a bad one of yours yet. So
well, I really appreciate that. Because I do put a lot of effort into that. Just because for me, I love talking about it. That's one. So I'm very passionate about the subject material. And I feel like, you can learn from everybody because everybody has a different perspective on how they look at success and how they look at failure and how they look at comedy and how, how they do their writing and just different things like that. And every perspective is it's a unique perspective. Mm-hmm. And even I've had guests on that have only been doing comedy for less than a year, and I've still been able to take something from that episode and that conversation that I didn't necessarily think about. And it goes back to, like I said, the ego. You can't let ego get in the way. If you let your ego get in the way of you're not going to necessarily get better. Mm-hmm. If you see somebody new and they have a suggestion and you're like, well, you're new, you don't know anything about comedy. Well, you're right. They might not know a lot about comedy, but they are still a human being with a brain and a perspective and all these other things. So you can't just completely disregard them. I mean, they still have a life experience, and that's, something that I try to always keep in mind with things is just, keep an open mind. And like I said, just listening and to a suggestion or anything like that, it doesn't mean you have to take the suggestion,
right,
and put it in there. I've had plenty of people give me some suggestions or tags or things like that, and I'm willing to try things. And sometimes I've tried it, and then I just didn't like how it did it or how it worked, and I never did it again. But to just completely disregard people because you think you're better than them, and even so because you've been doing comedy longer or whatever. It's, it's, to me, it's just not, you're not going to necessarily get better, because then what happens, you see a lot of comics that get stale, and kind of stagnate. They get there, they build their half hour, and then they get to their hour, and it's the same hour for 20 years. They don't ever improve because that's all they know.
Right. The fact that you have people who've only been doing it for a year or less, I bet that just totally improves them, because when you have a voice and you have a conversation like this, you bring something out of it. You always get a nugget. You always learn something. And I bet that has helped a lot of newer comics just get better at what they do.
Oh, I absolutely think so. And the other thing too, it's great because, well, I'll admit I'm not an expert at comedy, but I've been doing comedy a long time, and I've had a lot of my own unique experiences in comedy. I've produced, podcasts. I produced some independent TV stuff. I produced comedy festivals. I produced live shows. I've worked with celebrities. Like, I have all these different things that I've done in my toolbox. So while I'm not necessarily an expert and I don't know everything, a lot of times when I have a newer comic on, I'm able to give them nuggets too, because they'll have a perspective or whatever, and then we end up having a really good conversation where I'm like, well, blah 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 blah, whatever, and so I think it is really good for newer comics. And the great thing is too, especially if not just being a guest on it, but for people listening to the podcast, newer comics especially, there's a lot of experience on that podcast, and not just my experience, and it's not, you see all these interviews with, and that's why I like having, comics of all levels, and even, celebrity comics and comics you've never heard of, because a celebrity comic, they've been probably doing comedy a while and in doing well, but a lot of comics that would be considered celebrity comics, they might have worked the road, but they might not have worked the road a long time, and they're only a celebrity because they were living in LA doing TV. You know what I mean? Right. Which is a completely different experience. But then you get these comics that are road comics and nobody's ever heard of, but every weekend they're headlining shows and, working their butts off. They have a lot of experience too, because, and a different perspective.
Yeah.
So
I feel exactly the same. I do try to get some celebrities on just because I want to get their perspective, but a lot of them don't remember, even if they don't remember booking their own shows. They don't remember doing one-nighters at a VFW, and if they do remember it, it's hazy. So the ones that are in the thick of it are the ones that are really doing all the nuts and bolts it takes to survive being a comedian.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, it's all about perspective. That's what I really try to go for. I like to bring different perspectives, because at the end of the day, the whole objective behind the podcast is for everybody to get better. Learn from your mistakes and apply what you learned to get better at the next show.
You mentioned being a storyteller type comic. Tell me what kind of stories come up and what's happened in your life that has you've been able to make funny.
Well, like I said, a lot of it is just experiences. It's kind of a cross between observational and storytelling. Like a lot of my comedy too, I kind of do storytelling, a little bit of observational and self-degrading humor, because I can make fun of myself, and if somebody else gets offended that I made fun of myself, well, that's on them. You know what I mean? Like, I'm making fun of me. You're okay to laugh at that. Yeah. It's not where like I'm doing some racist material and being, insensitive to that, like to a full race of people or something like that, So you don't have to worry about getting in trouble either, because you're not doing that kind of material. You're focusing on yourself. It does sound egotistic, but it's it's hard to copy, when I'm
Uh-huh.
doing material about my life and my experiences. Nobody else, I mean, they could steal the jokes word for word, but it's not going to come off as genuine because it's not their story to tell.
Right.
So, like I have a story about getting a new security system at our house, just because it was funny. A funny situation happened while we were getting the security system installed. And so then I just, I exaggerate onto that story to make it even, make it a little funnier.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I've had all kinds of different life experiences too. That's the other thing. I've actually had a friend that was kind of pointed it out to me, and I didn't even realize it. He was like, Dan, you've lived so many different lives. It's crazy because, I was married for 12 years. Then I've also owned a business for a long time. I've worked different jobs. I've lived in different places, and like I've had all these different, now I do comedy, and I've had like all these little different lives. And so it's easy to draw material from that kind of stuff. I went through a really bad breakup, and I did a whole one-man show that is, I independently produced it. It streams on Amazon and YouTube. Shameless plug. It was supposed to be a love story.
Okay.
But I took that whole event, that whole relationship, and turned it into a whole show, So just
That's really
things
cool.
like that.
Are we still
Did
here?
I lose you?
Yeah.
Oh,
no,
I
I thought
I lost you.
it actually sounded like a drop off, didn't it?
It did. That's why I was like, because I had finished what I was saying, and then you didn't. I thought, oh shoot, did we lose him? I still edit this out.
I actually thought I heard a click. So yeah, well, whatever.
Yeah.
So doing all this stuff, do you get yourself into a habit of writing? Are you like a Seinfeld type writer where you sit down and make sure you write 2 hours a day, or what's your writing style?
I do not have a writing style that is like most people in the fact that I don't actually sit down and physically write. In fact, I have joke books that barely have any jokes in them because when I started, I was very strict and very pen to paper, word for word, and then rehearsing the joke, which made me very tight on stage, very scripted, and I wasn't as loose, and you could see that. And I've always had a really good memory. So a lot of times my writing process is when something I think is funny or I have a funny idea for a joke, I work the wording out in my head and kind of get how I want it. I basically write it in my head and then I perform it on stage to get it out there and see how it sounds. And then I just, I work on polishing it from there, changing it however I need to, if a certain part doesn't get a laugh, why didn't it get a laugh? Oh, well, it's probably really wordy. And because of that, because I'm more of a storyteller, a lot of my jokes end up being very wordy. So then it's a lot of editing out, cutting the fluff and getting, more direct and to the point.
So you can probably kind of bob and weave on stage based on your audience then, because you're not sticking to a script.
No, exactly. I mean, I have my core jokes, and I have a rhythm and kind of, a way that I tell them, an order, if you will. But I also, because I don't write out set lists and I don't have a particular script, I can weave away from it and I can do them out of order too. That's the other thing. Sometimes, something happens and I get pulled in a different direction it's still doing my material, and then I can pull it back and go back to some of this other material or whatever. So it's, it's made, and I feel like too, being less scripted on stage, even though I'm scripted and I'm telling my own jokes and doing my own material, I feel like I come off more likable and almost more approachable, like people can tell that I'm there to have fun. I'm not just got to do my word for word bit.
What type of audience? What type of audience do you like the most?
An audience my age, plus or minus 5 years.
I totally dig
which is
that.
terrible. But yeah, because that's actually something I've talked a lot about on the podcast too, is that because I'm very self-aware and I feel like my demographic is really my age plus or minus 5 years. And so I struggle with older audiences and I struggle with younger audiences and things like that, which I'm, and that's something I'm aware of. So I'm always trying to work on that to make that better.
Yeah.
I'm aware that that happens. So
yeah,
I try to do better. And a lot of that comes to being relatable, like that's where I really focus on the kind of material too that I do, like talking about being divorced and marriage and life isn't very relatable to people in their younger 20s because not most of them haven't experienced that.
Oh, yeah.
And then going into an older audience and making all kinds of video game references or nerd references or whatever it may be, they're not going to necessarily get the references. So it's really about, you got to really figure out your material, the kind of material that's going to work for the audience.
I think you probably experience the same thing I do when you go up on stage and the audience is mostly 20 somethings. You can just see them going, oh no. I mean,
absolutely.
You get judged as soon as you walk up. You don't even have to say a word.
Yeah. Oh no. I did as for a kind of a favor for a friend, her son. I did their post prom party, and I did it really cheap because it was somebody that I went to school with or whatever, and I was opening. Basically, they had also hired a hypnotist, so I was opening for him. I had to do like a half hour, and at that time, I was very eager to take any gig. Because I was, I just moved back to the area, trying to get out there, yada, yada, yada. Well, I go to this gig. It's also post-prom, so it's like at 1 a.m. But I walked into the auditorium, and I'm just hanging out, kind of talking to this hypnotist guy who I'd just met. And then, the kids start coming in, sitting in the bleachers. And I'm like, I literally was just like to myself, and I think I've said it out loud. I was like, yeah. This is going to be real interesting because everything I'm going to joke about, you're not going to get. And a lot of the stuff they didn't laugh at because they didn't understand it. Of course, some of the adults that were there and the teachers and the parents that were there were laughing at the material, but the kids were just staring at me like, why did they hire this guy? And then, and then in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, I was not a good fit for that.
Yeah.
Audience.
I tell you something I've done this works for me, and it helps me get different audience members on my side when I have a mixed audience. I pepper my act with young language, young slang, and old slang. And I refer to my wife as my boo, my bae, and my shorty throughout the act. And then I use words like bunk and golly gee willikers. And the funny thing is you mesh them all together, and young people just laugh crazy at you just because of the way you say the words. So that's something I learned, and it's I'm learning a whole new language by doing it too.
Yeah. That's another thing too, is language is a good example of that, because younger people have different slang than older people, and if you're not up to date on things, you're going to come across very goofy.
Yeah. And the nice thing is we have the internet, and there's like slang thesauruses out there, and you can do all kinds of stuff with it. I research words all the time just so I can say the right word.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, research is, and that goes back to learning, and listening. Listening isn't just with your ears when somebody talks. Listening is also observation, and it's observation of your audiences and your shows, and looking and analyzing what worked, what didn't, different, and kind of figuring out what you can do to be better in the situation the next time. When you got to the point where you were ready and you knew you were ready, you could either feature or headline or whatever. What did you do with club owners to sell yourself, to get yourself gigs? Well, I'm still in that process. So that's a thing and that's a learning process. A lot of what I end up doing, especially because, I was doing okay out in California as far as my level. I was starting to get more feature spots and more headlining spots, but it didn't really pay. A lot of them they do showcase style shows. There's not really, in the Midwest, it's more of a, 3-person show where you have an MC, feature, headliner. Sometimes there's a guest spot. So it's very, that's the way most shows in the Midwest are. Out there, it was, like I said, you might have 10 comics on a show. So you're not getting a lot of stage time. So part of the reason I moved back to the Midwest is because I wanted to start featuring more, wanted to start working the road more so I could get more time and develop my skills as a feature and a headliner. As far as reaching out to clubs and stuff, I just, I'm still working on trying to figure that out. A lot of times I just email their website, if they have like an info or if they have a booking contact or that kind of thing. And I, ask what the submission process is. Another thing in the Midwest that a lot of people don't necessarily know, but a lot of comedy clubs don't do their own booking. They use booking agencies, because they don't have the time to do the booking themselves or the network. So they just want to run a club. So they'll hire another company to do the booking. And so then it's a matter of trying to find out who books the club and what you need to do to submit and what they're, kind of looking for and things like that. And the best thing I can say is that when you do get booked at a gig, do your best and you put as much as you can into it. But also, and more importantly, be nice. Be nice. If you show up and you're a host or a feature and you're a jerk to everybody, they're not going to want you to come back. That's and those comics that you're working with aren't going to want to work with you. And then they're also going to tell other people that you're a jerk.
Yep.
And then other people aren't going to you're going to get a reputation where people aren't going to want to work with you because you're not nice.
Yep.
Word
in the comedy community travels fast and it goes coast to coast.
No, absolutely. And it doesn't take much to be nice. Being nice is just simply, learning the staff's names, and treating them like people but just staying out of the way too, and not necessarily having to talk with them, like just being aware that they're there plays a huge part in how, being nice to other people.
Right. Have you ever worked with a feature that just was so bad that they killed the room for you?
Well, I don't know necessarily because like I said, I'm still a lot of the stuff that I've headlined is my own independent stuff that I've booked myself. So I've pretty much brought my own people because it's all been independent stuff. So I haven't had to deal with that. But I mean, I've obviously been on shows with comics that did terrible and killed the whole room, from open mics to showcases to, regular shows. It happened. I mean, I've probably been that feature. I know I've been that feature. I know I've had shows. I did a casino gig and I was a terrible feature, not because I was trying, but I just was not. The audience just was not with me. And it wasn't like I was doing all new material. I was doing material that has proven funny at other shows. That particular weekend, all the audiences weren't having me, and so I definitely felt, the host did a great job and I definitely felt like I killed the energy because I did horrible,
Did that give you the idea for the Art of Bombing podcast?
No, by that time I was already doing this podcast. Okay. So that just gave me more to talk about.
more fuel, right?
Yeah. It was a corporate gig that got me to inspire the Art of Bombing podcast. Yeah, it was just a bad situation. A lot of it boiled down to, it wasn't, after I listened back to the audio, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was, but at the same time, a lot of it was just inexperience. That's why it is bad. That's why I didn't do well. It was inexperience. But at the time and in the moment, I felt like I did horrible. Like I said, I almost, right after the show, I was basically had a comedy breakdown where I was like, I got to quit comedy. I'm not good at this. There's no way I can keep doing this, and I had to call one of my comedy buddies, Nathan Holtz, who I mentioned, earlier about being one of the standouts when I first started. I called him and he had to talk me off the ledge. And I was like, just wait till tomorrow, Dan. Just tomorrow's a new day. You'll feel better, that kind of thing or whatever. So yeah, I was like ready to quit. And then, obviously I didn't. And, but yeah, so that's what inspired the podcast. Cause then after that, I started thinking about, that's what really pivoted me to start looking more at failure than the good shows and to see what I needed to do to improve, to get better. And then from that, I decided I wanted to start talking to other people about it to see what they thought. Because when I started this podcast too, there wasn't any kind of a podcast like this where they were looking at the failure in comedy in that perspective. It was all the good stuff, fun shows, parties, after parties, killing on stage, all that stuff. Nobody was talking about this. And so I thought, well, this is a unique perspective. And it was cool because as I've did it over time, I've learned, like I said, that bombing is part of comedy. And every comic that I've talked to will admit this for the most part, but we don't always talk about it because we don't want to talk about it, because it's bad. It's like reliving a horrible trauma for a comedian.
And as a comic, I feel like you almost have to build up a callus for the bombing, because I think most people have had the experience that you had where you had to call somebody to talk you off the ledge. You were going to quit comedy, and then bombing always sucks still, but it gets to the point where, okay, I bombed, next show is going to be better, and just move on from it. And always make sure you know why you bombed so that you can make yourself better for that type of audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you have to make yourself better. Like there's always continuous improvement is a big thing in everything, in all aspects of life, I feel like. And that's something coming from, before I did comedy, I worked in a corporate world that was big on continuous improvement. Like that was a thing, always trying to get better, to make our products better and, make our clients and customers happier and things like that. And I've always kind of applied that to life is, I'm not perfect. I'll never be perfect, and I can always be better. So what steps do I have to take to get better? Mm-hmm. And I feel like everybody can. It's all about, like I said, continuous improvement. Get better, be better.
Yeah, that's funny. My company does that, the continuous improvement thing. So I can totally dig that. I can actually apply that to myself now that you mentioned it. So you gave me a good nugget there. Thank you.
I'm glad. It's one of them things that's like it's a small phrase or thing, but it can make a big difference. Mm-hmm. Continuous improvement. I mean, it's 2 words, but those 2 words are very impactful when you start applying it to things.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been talking with some comics about, and I just one on the podcast, but I've talked to a lot of people offline, is kind of the cancel culture that we're experiencing right now. And I wanted to bounce this off you because, obviously you're kind of a clean storytelling comic, and you're not one of those, over the top type of guys like a Jim Norton or whatever. And we've got a lot of folks that are kind of getting beat up for stuff that they did years ago. What's your take on that? When do you think people need to be forgiven, and for what types of things can they be forgiven for?
Oh man, well, I feel like it depends on the seriousness of what it is. I mean, cancel culture goes more than just saying words. I mean, part of it is behavior. I mean, you look at comics. There's a lot of sexual abuse and sexual predators in comedy. There's discrimination against women and things like that, so it really depends on the severity. I mean, I feel like everybody if they do the work, that's the other thing. Some comics don't want to do the work. They're just like, I said it then and blah, blah, blah. And, and I'm still this way and I don't care. And it's my life, that kind of thing or whatever. And well, they obviously don't want to change. But then, take somebody, because even I did material that I'm not proud of and I can acknowledge it. And I have acknowledged it and I've, apologized for it. And then I work to be a better performer. So I feel like there's got to be some leeway with, different things that people said and have done in the past, because another thing people don't realize either. I mean, there's so many variables that need to be thought about before you just like, canceled. And I think that's where, younger generations don't quite grasp that concept. They're just so eager, especially with the internet now and social media. We're just so quick to cancel. Like that's our thing now. We just, said a bad word, cancel, which then there's so many other variables. You got to look at the time that it was said too, because a lot of some of these jokes, while they might not have aged well, and if they said them today, they would not be good. And they would have, they'd definitely be, ran out or whatever. But back when they did the joke, it was probably socially acceptable to do that joke, So that's the other thing. You got to look at how society has changed and evolved over time. And how has the performer changed and evolved over time? Is that performer doing that same joke that they did then, now? Or has their material evolved?
It's funny, two things. I'm really glad nobody was recording me and there wasn't internet when I was young, because I wouldn't have fared very well in the comedy industry if people knew how I was back then, the things I said and did. And the other thing is I've been rewatching the Larry Sanders Show with Gary Shandling, and I tell you what, they could not do that show today. And you talk about sexist and racist comments and stuff like that. I mean, they ran the gamut on it.
Yeah, definitely. They definitely did. And that's with anything though. I mean, you look at even, stuff that, comedy from the 70s and to the 80s and to the 90s and the 2000s and now the 2020s. Like it's constantly evolving as society evolves, and how communication can be out there. That's another thing, back in those times, you didn't have the internet to things to go viral or, people to be put in their place right away. People said things and they didn't get called out on it not because people weren't willing to call them out. It's just that nobody knew they were doing it.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and I think as we evolve, I think that, people my age especially just need to watch and listen like what you do, and adjust the way we behave by what the social norms are supposed to be now.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it was right when we did it back in the 70s. But it amplifies the fact that it's wrong now, because we need to treat people better.
No, absolutely. And that's continuous improvement. It goes back to that.
Yeah.
It's continuous improvement. You always strive to be better, do better, and get better. That's, and as people, as humanity in general, we can do that, and we should all be striving to do that.
So I asked this question to just about everybody I've had on the podcast, and I'm going to shoot it over to you, Dan. What are the 3 things that you know about stand-up comedy now that you wish you would have known when you started?
I wish I would have knew what comedy really was. Like I said, I had a different vision of what comedy was, and that was from what I saw on TV. I wish I knew what you really had to sacrifice to do comedy, what it actually takes, like that goes back to kind of what you see on TV. You just assume, you start comedy, you go to LA, you get on TV, boom, you're there. that's not the case. Most people that end up being successful have been doing comedy for 20 years before they even blow up. And they've been doing a lot of stuff in the background and that kind of thing. So that would have been a nice thing to know. And what really would have been nice to know is how to reach out to bookers and find shows. There's no real guide on how to start comedy. Granted, now we have the internet and people have written a lot of stuff now about that kind of thing. But when I started, I had no clue about what it took to get booked at a club or, a show or anything, or even how to really find a show. I mean, the internet was around, but it was just kind of starting, the
only thing I like about this whole pandemic thing is the clubs that I never knew about are coming out of the woodwork and doing those virtual shows, and the stuff shows up on my timeline because I get in these different groups and stuff, and I'm making notes of all these clubs because I never knew about them before, but now I know about them. And when, if things ever go back to normal, then they're on my list now. So that's the one good thing.
Yeah. No, that is a good point. Yeah, I've seen that too. I've been kind of taking note of clubs. And then like I said, I've been trying to reach out and find out what I need to do to submit to them,
Yeah.
So
Dan, first of all, how can people find you, both the podcast and your comedy page?
So I have a website, danbublitz.com. You can find me there. Also, I have most of my social media is at Bublitz Comedy. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I have a comedy Facebook page. You can follow that as well. And then the Art of Bombing, it's the same. We have the artofbombingpod.com. So that's the main website. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts. It's iTunes, Google. Well, I guess it's Apple now, not iTunes, but wherever all podcast apps have it. And then the social media for that is Art of Bombing Pod. So that's both on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So like I said, the Facebook page is a real good way to support and see the latest episodes and try to get, involved in what we're doing with that.
Mm-hmm. And I just have to say, and I'm not bullshitting here. Yours is one of the podcasts that I make an effort to listen to because it's got content, it's got meat to it, and I really, really enjoy it.
Oh, I really appreciate that. That makes me feel good because that's at the end of the day, that's what I'm trying to achieve. I don't make any money doing my podcast. I get the enjoyment of having the conversations with people, which is great. But, the whole point of that I do it is that hopefully it helps somebody else get better.
Yeah.
So when I hear good feedback like that, I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And a podcast is just a money black hole. It's just like open your wallet and watch the money get sucked into it.
Yep.
And the more you want to do well, the more it costs. I mean, all the little tips and tricks that you can do, and Google ads and all that kind of stuff, it just costs money. So yeah, I totally dig that. But it's a labor of love, so that's all it needs to be.
Yep, that's exactly it. Labor of love. Because like you said, as time goes and you want to do better with the podcast, that means you invest more money on equipment and things like that. So
yeah, I got to tell you, this Rodecaster I got is the best piece of equipment I've ever had.
Yeah, the equipment, it's amazing. I have a Yamaha mixing board. I have a Zoom. I have, a new mic for my computer, and, I just upgraded my computer and all this different stuff, so I'm like always spending money. And like I said, we're going to go full circle. It all goes back to continuous improvement.
Yep. No doubt. And when I think about the stuff I used when I started, I'm like, oh my God, how did I even put those out?
I think that a lot, especially the fact that I used my phone to record a lot of them.
Yeah.
My early ones. So
All right. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being on the podcast. There was a lot of good stuff here. And, I wish you the best, both with your comedy career and your podcast. I think you're a good guy and you're doing good stuff out there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, keep listening to the podcast and and do it up. Keep getting better, everybody.